Correlation versus causation can actually be a logical fallacy that gets lumped in with motivated cognition and reasoning. Personally, I like setting it outside of this discussion because it can also just be through a lack of understanding statistics and how experimental design works, which is a bit different from the discussion we're going to be having here. Motivated cognition is a varied and complex set of cognitions that every person has that colors the way that we see the world. It directs the information we gather, how we process it, and what we do with that processed information. And though it certainly has some benefits to identity preservation and speed, it can also be incredibly dangerous in our search for scientific or really any kind of truth. So what is it? Motivated cognition is the unconscious tendency to, through a variety of methods and biases, process information to suit some end goal. But remember, it's unconscious, so you aren't aware of that goal or consciously aiming for that goal. It's just that whenever we see anything, it's filtered through our mental processes, beliefs, biases, and tendencies. And we don't generally see the truth, but rather some contorted version of the truth that has made it through all of that processing. Or as Kelvin here says, it's a sort of selective reality. This is an umbrella term that encompasses a lot of different biases and ways of thinking. So let's talk about some of the general ways that people go about doing this first. It's important to note that no matter what we do, no matter how smart we are, no matter how much we know specifically about these, we can never truly be rid of them. Intelligence does not save you. It can actually make it worse. We tend to be very, very good at seeing these sorts of things in other people, especially once they're pointed out to us. So go ahead and use that in order to initially spot what we're talking about in other people. But then, during your day-to-day life, continually think about how you are doing this as well. And note that I don't say if you are doing this, I say how. One of the main ways that this occurs is through selecting and curating information sources that mainly agree with you, or reading those that disagree with you in a way where that information never truly gets through. I don't think that this graph is perfect, but as a really, really good approximation, it's very helpful to see where most of your news comes from. You ideally want to select a variety from the top of the graph, and ideally for anything you read too far to the left or right, you would want to read similar to the other side. Now, fixing the, quote, what you read is relatively easy if you try. You just read more of the other sides or more of the middle. Now, changing how you read is tricky. If you're only reading the other side to say that you do, or only doing it to mentally argue with it, or worse, only doing it to feel superior to it, well, that's still motivated cognition. You want to read it with an open mind and a willingness to see how other viewpoints may make sense, even if it doesn't mean you're necessarily going to change your own mind. Now, for the high quality stuff anyways, definitely don't read natural news or InfoWars with an open mind. That stuff is poison. Largely, it's just an easy place to go if you want to find, say, terrible journal articles for designing a class. Another way that people can do motivated cognition is that they process the data or assimilate it in a biased way. What I discussed on the previous slide about reading news sources without really reading them could actually go here as well. It's kind of on the border. I thought instead of talking about literature on this, I'd mention something that can have a lot to do with mental health. How you assimilate information about the world and your life deeply affects your view of it. Many people will tend to focus overly heavily on the negative aspects of life. Depending on the specifics of now versus future, this can be either a negativity or a pessimism bias. But this is the type of person who will read 100 positive comments about their work and blow them off to pay attention to that one negative comment. Perhaps not even sleeping at night because we are so focused on it. They'll do 100 things right and one wrong, and will dwell on that one wrong thing. And that's not good for our mental health to do that, even if it often winds up in a personality type that is quite successful at school. You know, the kind that winds up in honors classes and such. Those of us that do this will tend to be at higher risk for depression. And a lot of therapies will focus on shifting the focus to a more balanced view of life, where you aren't putting the blinders to the bad, but you're just taking away the blinders that seem to block out the good in life. There is, of course, lots of other kinds too, but especially in the world as it currently is, I thought it might be worth showing how these things can also affect our mental health and day-to-day well-being. Of course, if we want to talk about this in terms of news or literature, there's also tons of examples. It can be just in terms of listening more critically to people who disagree with you. It can be forgetting stuff that does not agree with you while remembering and integrating things that does. For instance, remembering all your friends that happened to get the flu after they got the flu shot, but forgetting about all the ones who didn't. It could be someone you respect saying something incorrect, but because it came from someone you respected, you didn't question it. We are going to talk about cognitive biases, which will talk about all the many, many ways this bias information processing occurs, and even gives names to them. This next one is a bit different. Rather than the way that people do motivated cognition, it's the why behind why they do it, and the goal behind it. And this is the thing that I think is very prominent in our everyday lives. While I'm definitely far from vegan, I actually picked one of their memes for it. I'm a huge animal lover. I grew up in a family of hunters, and by basically any measure, deer rifle hunting has to be one of the least cruel ways to get meat. But by the time I was about 12, I really just couldn't go out to see the deer when my dad would bring them in. I'd avoid the garage until it was all done up and in the freezer. But I love venison. And I'd even help my mom pack up the meat sometimes. So I just have this finely crafted wall where meat looks like meat and therefore not an animal, and so I can eat it. In this case, it's a very conscious cognitive dissonance because I'd have to be an idiot to not know where my meat and my animals are the same. But hopefully it kind of shows you the idea. We do things like this subconsciously constantly, and meat is actually a good example. There isn't much difference between a pig, a cow, a horse, and a dog if you raise them identically. But we use bacon ubiquitously and shun cultures that eat meat that's made from dog or horse. We can also get something that is almost the opposite of what I talked about on the last slide, where when bad things happen to a person, there is a tendency to see it as someone else's fault rather than their own. The classic here in education is when a student gets a bad grade, they'll often blame the teacher rather than the fact that they only studied a quarter of what the teacher told them to do. Not so common in this group of students, but very common in most classes. The idea is simply that we want to protect deeply held beliefs, even if that comes at the cost of truth. These are two depictions of that same idea. It's a bit harder to see this when we start talking about how people interpret scientific literature, but it's definitely still there. If your particular in-group feels a certain way about vaccines or GMOs, climate change, mask wearing, social distancing, trustworthiness of experts, or even Bigfoot, it's likely that you will too. And that colors your interpretation of the scientific literature. Heck, even if you're just like being a contrarian, and so you like to argue with anyone who you happen to come across, and that's a huge part of your identity, that colors your eventual positions as well. Because you may come across more of one type of people to argue with than the other. And that's a tough one to fix too. Although if you have some parents in rural areas, their Facebooks are a treasure trove of people to argue with if you ever need to find some. Now, let's take a couple of quick examples of this. Let's say we have a person who says, "Get your flu shot. You need it to protect yourself and others." And a person replies with, "I'm healthy. I don't need it. And there's no reason to get it anyways. It's not even effective." And you have someone else, or you have your first person who says, "It's super effective. Stop listening to your anti-vaxxer friends." And then at that point, you enter an argument death spiral that I don't even need to go down. So I think that this concept is super important because it explains why people can read the same paper and come up with vastly different conclusions. The range on the flu shot is generally between about 30 to 70% depending on the year. Usually it's on the higher end of that. This is a pretty perfect storm for people who have one set of beliefs to declare that it works, quote, and that the other group to declare that it, quote, it doesn't work. And in the group that says it doesn't work, there tends to be a pretty strong bias toward an appear to nature fallacies, anti-vaccine sentiments, and a general sense that they don't need modern medicine. Now, even though a 30% lower risk could mean 2 weeks of not feeling horribly ill and not giving it to others, they need to protect all of those aspects that they see as a part of who they are. Now, of course, there are others that are just too lazy to bother getting it, and that's a bit different. Yet even there, you'll often see something as simple as, "Ugh, I don't really want to go get a flu shot," will soon turn into rationalizing why they don't need to get it based on things like it's not effective anyways. And so that laziness can actually lead into this sort of argumentation, which is kind of an interesting connection. There is a lot of interesting research now being done into this concept and how to deal with it, because trying to change people's minds about really important scientific concepts can't necessarily be done with charts and graphs and numbers. And while often people like to paint anti-vaxxers as some sort of uneducated, stupid population, that is not what the research into this demographic shows at all, as the readings in this class will show you. So we'll get into this more in other classes and readings as well. Let's take a nearly identical argument that has slightly different identity protections in place. Wear a mask to protect against COVID-19. I'm not afraid of COVID-19. Yeah, it's not really about fear, it's for other people. Masks don't even work. Actually, they do. And I'm going to leave this as insert up-to-date research here because the exact statistics are changing a little bit. Well, I can't breathe in them. But you just said they don't work. Viruses are way bigger than, quote, air. You are stepping on my rights. Oh, so cool. Then you're in favor of female-bodied people not covering up boobs? Don't be ridiculous. That's different. Argument death spiral. Okay, I actually brought us a little ways into the argument death spiral anyways, but I wanted to kind of keep going with the identity protection idea. So when you follow through most of the anti-mask argument, viewing them through a lens of identity protection, they make a lot more sense than if you're trying to follow them based on any sort of rational argumentation. They don't want to live in a world where this virus is affecting how we live. And masks are this omnipresent annoyance that does that reminder for us. Among, of course, being generally mildly irritating until you get used to it. But it isn't a true value-based argument, because even once they get to freedom, there isn't freedom for things that are far less dangerous to the general public, this being one particular example. And it's important to recognize these arguments so that you know how to approach them, and if you even should. Often when you get into these identity protection types of arguments, these are the types that you lose friends over, or at least feel like you're banging your head against the wall. So is it worth it? Yet another I can't answer. Personally, I'll pick that battle if I think that I can budge the meter at all, or if I know that the person is just cool with arguing, or if, for instance, I'm trying to test out some technique for dealing specifically with these types of issues. But it isn't something that I walk into with any true hope of changing their minds, and there are often people that I will go out of my way to sidestep very far around these issues. Next up, motivated skepticism is a hugely important thing to learn about when you're learning about how to do critical analysis. We are teaching you how to be skeptical, and it becomes very, very easy to be largely skeptical of things that you don't believe, while not applying that same rigor to beliefs that you do want to continue having. And it's tricky, because every paper, every study has flaws and limitations. It's just the nature of doing complex things. But we can sort through that, and we can find out what we know is most likely to be true. However, those flaws also give a way for really smart people to exploit weaknesses, only where they want to. The aim in this class is for you to be universally skeptical, while carefully avoiding being cynical or a scientific nihilist. Things are not just good or bad. Trustworthiness and quality is a spectrum, and you want to make sure that you aren't applying different scales to different beliefs. I think the easiest place to see this one is when you hear people say, quote, follow the money. Let's pick pharmaceuticals. You'll hear a backlash against modern Western medicine based on it being all about the money and how much Big Pharma makes. Yet many of the people who will say things like that will also spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars a month on supplements without noticing that people are making a lot of money off them too. Supplements are a $30 billion a year industry in the US, with about a quarter of people on them. And that's not counting the illegal and not for human consumption stuff that doesn't get counted into that. And for most people, these are basically worthless. Now, am I telling you not to take supplements? Nope. I have many I take because of pregnancy and breastfeeding. And before that, I tried several to help speed healing so that I could work out more because I have pretty damaging hobbies. And I'm also not telling you that everything Big Pharma does is right. Absolutely not. They have done horrible things in the name of making money, not the least of which led to the opioid epidemics. What I'm saying is that skepticism is good, but that you need to apply it in a way that helps you make the best decisions possible, not in a way that just furthers your personal belief system, and that doing that is really, really hard. So next up, I'm going to have you go through a series of mini scenarios with your groups and talk about what types and kinds of motivated cognition they are using. Though there is an answer I had in mind while writing them, there are many right answers. Students have basically argued for every one of these for every scenario and been correct. So if you'd like, that is another direction that you could take with the activity, where you actually just walk through A, B, C, and D for each item and talk about how it relates. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through them all in detail here. If you have any questions about your discussions, we can talk about them in class. A lot of what we've talked about here, and many more, are broken up and detailed into very specific cognitive biases. This is a table of them, but there are probably more that have come out since then. Keep in mind that there is basically a sub bias of about any kind of flaw in thinking that you could make, but a lot of them are pretty easily grouped together. I'm going to go through a couple of my favorites in the next slide, and then send you looking for some more in groups. But I would, when you're going through these, try to get a general idea for the feel of them as opposed to the very specific name and trying to link up, this entire chart with each specific name. So first up, anchoring bias is an important one for things like negotiations. If you're negotiating for a price of a particular project fee with a person who does not know much about the said thing, if you start off negotiations at $2,000, you'll likely end up with a very different endpoint than if you start negotiations off at $1,000. People will tend to latch on to the first thing they hear. So if you can get them down from $2,000 to $1,500, they'll feel like they got a pretty good deal. Rather than if they started it off at $1,000 and you worked them up to $1,500, they'll feel like they were really compromised. Confirmation bias is the next one, and I am truly not doing this one justice. This goes back to what we talked about before, where we only listen to information that confirms our preconceptions, and it's so huge. And our social network bubbles and our news aggregators and our search engines are amplifying it by surrounding us with what are called echo chambers, or basically just inundating us with people who agree with us. We could teach an entire class on confirmation bias, but that just isn't what this class is, so we're going to go ahead and leave it here. Another common one is called the ostrich effect. An example of this is that stockholders will tend to check their holdings far more frequently when the stock market is doing well as compared to when it's doing badly. It's a way of shielding yourself from negative outcomes. And this comes up in anywhere in life. If you are having something bad happening to you, there's a chance that you'll want to just hide from it by, quote, burying your head in the sand. The last one I want to talk about, because it's also exceptionally important in scientific literature and experimental design. This is the tendency to focus only on surviving examples. This comes up a lot in parenting circles, actually. Often the older generation will say things like, well, you rode in the front seat at 5 years old and you're just fine. Or, we rode in cars without car seats and we're fine. And while that is true, it's forgetting or ignoring the fact that if they hadn't been one of the survivors, they wouldn't even be able to have that conversation because those kids would be dead. In scientific literature and experimental design, this comes up if people who drop out or die during the course of the study aren't taken into effect. So, for instance, if a study is looking at cognitive effects of a drug over a 20-year period, and they only look at survivors, they might miss the effects of the drugs on people who died from seemingly unrelated events like heart disease, or who dropped out of the study because of the cognitive effects. There are lots of ways to control for this in a well-done experiment, but there's also lots of ways to exploit this if you want to make a study show something that it might not otherwise. The example most often used to show this is that the military saw damaged planes coming back in the areas shown. The US military thought that it should add more armor to the parts that were getting hit. But a man named Abram Wald recognized that actually the opposite was true, because the hits should be more evenly distributed, which means that the planes taking the hits in the unmarked or low-marked areas weren't surviving to come back, and that those spots were actually the most critical to protect, and that's where your armor should go. And he probably saved a lot of lives by noticing this effect. Now, take a moment before going on in the video and considering the following question. Why do we have motivated cognition? Go ahead and pause the video. Take at least a minute to think about this, probably a little bit more if you can. As always, bonus points if you write it down and commit to an answer, and then you can come back and hear my thoughts on it. So there's a lot of reasons depending on the particular bias, but they tend to sort into 3 categories in many cases. If we're overloaded in information, it helps us to sort through that information and remember it. It can help us find meaning, and it's fast. All of these things are really important if we And if we didn't have mechanisms for all of this, we'd be in a lot of trouble cognitively. So they are useful. They just also lead us very astray, and we have to make sure that we account for the bad that comes along with the good. And of course, remember that being smart won't save you from this. So you have to actively seek ways to avoid your biases, as opposed to just treating it as something that goes away with intelligence. It's worth remembering that some of the smartest minds in history use science to argue for horrifically racist policies, up to and including eugenics. These weren't stupid people, and I'd argue that they weren't truly evil people, as most people define evil. They were just an artifact of their culture, and they didn't spend the time and the energy on overcoming their biases that they needed to escape the fate of falling into those horrific traps. We can't be good people by any definition other than our culture if we don't step outside of our culture. And we can't do that unless we constantly evaluate our cognitive biases to see where we are just going with the flow. Maybe spend some time thinking about these things that we take for granted today as, quote, normal, that our grandkids will judge us harshly on as we judge ours. And while you're thinking about that, try to go beyond the easy answers, right? There's certainly easy answers, obviously our treatment of race being one of them, for what people will probably look badly on us today. But try to think of some other ones that aren't in our culture at the moment, that aren't at the forefront of our thoughts, that many years from now our grandkids are going to look back on us and say, they thought what? And then think about how we can do it better. We're going to cover some ideas on what we can do better in the next video, but if you can give that some thought before watching it, it will probably make that meaning stick a little bit more for you. For your group activity this time, I want you to go through and pick 4 cognitive biases from your list. And then have these to the point, discuss them, come up with examples to the point where you could present them in class if we were going to do that. We're not going to, just because of the setup of the course, but that's kind of the idea behind the activity. I have a couple of examples here that you can kind of read through and see what we're looking for. Try to pick ones that are either really relative to your own life or are kind of entertaining where you would remember them. Bonus points if you can come up with ones that you do. But it's generally easiest if you try to find ones that other people do. Because again, you see this easier in other people. And generally the ones that other people do are also going to be the ones that you do most often, just from a statistics point of view.